Any of us who are in the federal labs can take great pride that many of our inventions, or maybe the technologies we sponsored, really are at the heart of so many of today's products that each of us uses every day.
Welcome to the Transfer Files, inside the world of federal innovation. This is your insider's look at how federal laboratories bring groundbreaking technologies to market. I'm your host, Andrea Nelson. In every episode, we'll bring you insights and expertise from throughout the world of tech transfer. If you want to take an invention from the lab where it was created and turn it into a product that's on store shelves, there are so many people who have to come together, get on the same page, and get over the unexpected hurdles that can come along the way. Each of these players may have different priorities, concerns, and perspectives. And if you've sat in the other person's seat, for instance, if you're an entrepreneur who's been the inventor on the other side of the table, it can really help. Our guest today sat in more than one of those seats over more than 40 years in research and development management. Dick Paul served a 33-year career in the Air Force, serving in 3 Air Force laboratories and leading as the first commander of the Air Force Research Laboratory, and retiring as a major general. After his military service, Dick became a vice president at Boeing, where he helped lead research and technology for commercial aircraft and defense-related products and systems. Dick has also served on the National Science Foundation's Small Business Innovation Research Advisory Committee and on numerous boards of directors, from chairing the board of the Innovation Research Interchange to vice chairing the board of the Seattle Symphony Orchestra. He is also the chair of the FLC's National Advisory Council. And in our conversation, we talk about how his diverse background comes into play in that role. We also get into some of the biggest challenges facing technology transfer and how to overcome them, how senior leaders can foster success, and a lot more. Please enjoy my conversation with Dick Paul.
Dick Paul, first of all, welcome. And I do want to say, for your years of service in the Air Force, thank you for your service.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. To jump in, we're celebrating the FLC's 50th anniversary, a huge milestone. And you've been in federal tech transfer for more than 40 of those 50 years, which is just incredible. What were some of the most pivotal moments and most significant changes in your mind in that history?
Well, I have to say at the outset, I really haven't been in the trenches of technology transfer. I haven't been in an ORDA, but I think probably the most revealing part of my experience with tech transfer is when I was commander of the Air Force Research Lab. I would do speaking engagements, and very often I would get asked questions about technology transfer. And I was pretty much of a neophyte when I started that. But I got to know my ORDA very well, and they coached me on technology transfer. And I think I got so I could represent our tech transfer story pretty well. But the lesson I really learned there was how important it was for senior leadership to support ORDAs and tech transfer. And that's particularly true, I think, in the Department of Defense, or at least the Air Force, because our focus, what we're measured on, is transition, not transfer. Transitioning technologies to the warfighter. That's what our mission is. Transfer is kind of thought of as a secondary mission, I think, in the Air Force, at least when I was on active duty. So I really learned how important it was to bolster up and support the transfer mission as well as the transition mission.
Could you take just a second to speak to that distinction, just for any listeners who might be a little unclear about what is the difference between transition and transfer?
Sure. So when we talk about technology transition, it is about taking the technologies we developed and moving those to the warfighter, moving those in support of the military mission. Transfer, again, in the Department of Defense context, is using those same technologies for a non-military mission. So we may develop sensor technology to help the warfighter detect threats and prosecute threats. But very often that same sensor technology might have healthcare applications or safety applications on a school bus. So that's the difference. We really get measured on how much technology do we transition, but not as much on the transfer side. And moving those technologies to non-military applications is what I think of as transfer.
I see. And that takes a lot of awareness of things outside of your immediate sphere, I would imagine.
Yeah, very much so. And that's where the order really comes in and earns their money. We have all kinds of people focused on getting our technology to the warfighter, but only a handful who really look at what the applications might be for non-military missions. And that takes a great awareness of what some of the opportunities are out there in the non-defense, non-military sector.
And you, after more than 40 years in the military, you did transition out to the industry side, and you've had the benefit of holding positions that gave you firsthand insight. From my perspective, I see it as three different perspectives. I see it from the federal lab side, from big industry, and then also with startups and small businesses. So from that experience, what was the most valuable or maybe surprising understanding that you gained from those different perspectives?
Well, I think maybe the most surprising at first, and then it wasn't a surprise after a while, is that industry doesn't know about the federal labs, and they don't know about tech transfer. That's true for large industry, but it's especially true for startups and small businesses. So while we in the labs may assume industry knows about us, they don't. At the 99% level, they are not aware. And then even when they become aware, you see the challenge from their perspective of how do I penetrate this federal bureaucracy? How do I make contact and talk to someone who might have a technology to help me out? And of course, that's where the ORTAs, in my mind, play a huge role. So I think that's a problem I saw early on. I think it still exists today, probably almost to the same degree. Educating industry and particularly startups on the existence of the federal labs and our T2 mission is just so important and takes continuous work.
And it seems like it would be particularly challenging if you constantly have new entrants in that world that you have to educate.
Yeah, it is. And that's why you can't do this one time. You can't, the federal labs can't go out and say, okay, we published a magazine article, we went to a tech fair, our work is done. It is over and over and over because there are new players in industry. There are new startups all of the time. There's new players on the federal lab side as well. So it really can't be personality dependent. It needs to be process oriented, and there needs to be an established process and then executing that process. Easier said than done.
Like many things. And understanding the perspective that you have and speaking the language of these different players and stakeholders is invaluable, as we've been talking about in tech transfer, given the need for collaboration and synergy. Is there a situation that stands out in your memory when your unique asset that you had came into play?
Well, I think maybe one of the first aspects came when I retired from the Air Force and I went to work for Boeing in Seattle. And I was involved in Boeing's research and development activities there. And Boeing had an office called External Technology. And its mission was, number one, to understand what Boeing's needs were. And then secondly, reach out externally to the company to see if we could find technologies to meet those needs. Because the Boeing preference, and I think industry's preference in general, is they would rather acquire the technology than invent the technology. No need to reinvent something that has already happened. And that's where I saw firsthand that industry really is hungry for and seeking external technologies. And of course, having just come from the federal labs, I knew that was a treasure trove of technologies, and that the Department of Defense had this mission to move those technologies out of the lab. So I think it really crystallized to me when I first set foot on the industry side how important this connection really was.
For those in tech transfer who don't have the varied firsthand experience that you have had, who've maybe only worked from the government side or the industry side, what advice would you offer to help them understand, maybe see beyond their own sphere, collaborate with potential partners?
Well, I think each player really needs to be proactive in putting themselves in the other player's shoes. Um, so for federal labs, to me, that means go to various industry meetings, association meetings, tech fairs. An ideal one to me is SBIR Phase 2 conferences, where the startups sponsored under SBIR often have booths, and the entrepreneurs are there, and they're trying to sell their technology. And federal labs can go by there and say, hey, I think I could help out with that. Mm-hmm. And then the same goes for industry. Industry should try to put itself in federal lab situations. Go to lab days. Go to and visit federal labs where you can. And I know it's probably harder for industry to visit federal labs, but there are opportunities, and ORDAs are ideal for pointing out what those are and getting industry access to the scientists and engineers in the labs. That's who industry really wants to talk to. They want to talk to the scientists and engineers in the lab who have the technologies, and vice versa, I would guess.
Right, right. And I'd like to transition to your work as the chair of at the FLC's National Advisory Council, or NAC. You lead a group of volunteers from a broad range of backgrounds. There's people from large and small industries, venture capital, university tech transfer, local, state government, public-private partnerships, nonprofit associations, government agencies. You've got everyone across the board. So, and they work as a collection of independent parties who don't have a horse in the race, so to speak. So the NAC is able to advise the FLC's executive board on how to achieve its mission to promote federal tech transfer. That's a big task. How do you approach such a massive task with specific sort of advice? And could you give a few examples of maybe how the NAC has helped propel the FLC forward in recent years?
Well, I'll try. I'll try to see if I can. First of all, you really touched on in your opening comment there the secret to the NAC, and that is to have a broad diversity of professional experience. The federal labs obviously have all the expertise they need on transitioning technology from the federal side. And what we try to bring is a perspective from the non-federal lab side of the ecosphere. So it's all those entities that you named. So we try to be sure we have a diversity of representation across all those entities, especially industry, but all the others as well: academia, local and state government, venture capital, other nonprofit associations, all the ones you just went through. That diversity is what I think allows us to give a unique perspective to the FLC. And I would say the second thing is I learned very early on that we should only work on topics that FLC is interested in. There's a lot of topics that come to our minds, but the trick is, what does FLC want from us? What kind of advice? And so we don't work on anything that FLC leadership does not want us to pursue. They will suggest topics. Sometimes we will suggest topics to them, but we won't expend any energy on pursuing them until FLC leadership and NAC leadership has agreement. This is something worthwhile, and if we put our energy into it, it might have a result that could be useful to the FLC.
It sounds like the same kinds of sort of skill set and insight you have, practice you have of thinking from the other person's shoes comes into play in the NAC too.
Yeah, very, very much so. Because the members of the NAC very often they've had their shoes in the federal lab side as a stakeholder, some even as a federal lab employee, because some are retired federal lab employees who have gone on to industry or are doing other things. And so our members also tend to be more senior, more seasoned. Not that we don't want fresher perspectives, but it's the people who have been in the trenches, who have fought the battle before and have some scars that we want to bring in to offer some advice. I don't think I fully answered your question too, because you asked, I believe, Andrea, what kind of things do we work on? And there's a couple of categories, broad categories, I would say we work on. One is how to enhance the technology transfer mission for the federal labs. So some of the kinds of things we have worked on in the past is how manufacturing technology in the federal labs might better reach the ecosystem of stakeholders where manufacturing today is so critical across the board. So we have people who are on the manufacturing side who will talk about what might be done to better enhance the impedance match, so to speak, between the labs and industries or associations who work on manufacturing. The other broad category is actually FLC operations, because we have people who have been in industry and they have gone through strategic planning. FLC just went through strategic planning. So they will ask us, what are some good lessons learned in successful strategic planning that your company or your entity did? Or one we just completed, FLC has geographic regions. Do other companies have regions or subgroups? And we just addressed that in one of our calls. Geographic regions. Sometimes they're non-geographical networks that are organized functionally, not geographically. Sometimes they are workshops that are technology focused. So we try to bring those views and just surmise how might those be applied or overlaid to FLC's current model. So long answer to your question, but those are kind of two categories of things that we've been focusing on in the last couple of years.
Right. Well, it's a big task, so a long answer is fitting. What do you see then as some of the biggest challenges facing members of the federal tech transfer ecosystem? Where do they need support, and how can the FLC meet those needs?
Well, I'm going to return to a previous theme, so I'm going to be repeating myself to some extent. But I think the greatest opportunities are getting federal labs connected to industry people or other entities who have needs. And it's very, very difficult to do that. It's very time consuming, but I've become convinced that the better approach is what I call a requirements pull approach, where what you do is try to identify technology needs that industry has and then seek solutions in the labs, as opposed to a tech push approach where you take all the technologies in the labs and just push them out there and hope somebody from industry will see one of them and latch onto them. That's fairly inefficient, I think, and less effective to do that. So how do you make these connections? And I think the key is you have to be very strategic about it if you're in a federal lab. the federal labs don't have the resources to chase every industry or every commercialization opportunity. So it takes, I think, being strategic about it, looking at where the most probable targets are, and then trying to focus critical mass on those targets. So it may mean picking a few targets and putting mass against them and seeing if you have success, rather than spreading yourself too thin and chasing every kind of ad hoc opportunity that comes along. Again, it's a very difficult problem, but I think a requirements pull approach and a strategic approach on the part of the labs and FLC is really the only way to get success with such a broad number of stakeholders out there and a broad number of technologies in the federal labs.
Looking forward, what vision do you have for the NAC's continued involvement in shaping the future of federal technology transfer and innovation?
Well, I just hope we can keep adding value. And I don't know if we are adding value. That is a question you ought to ask in one of your podcasts with FLC leadership, is if the NAC is adding value, because all we do is provide advice. FLC can use it as it wishes if it's applicable. But I just hope we continue to get good, intellectually challenging questions from FLC leadership like we have the past couple of years, and that we can maintain a group of very interested and engaged NAC members. Because the NAC members are busy people. They often have full-time jobs. A couple are retired, but they're very busy in retirement as well. And so they are doing all this on their own. They're not getting paid to do it. It's because of their interest in the federal labs and their belief in the importance of the tech transfer mission. So if we can keep getting challenging topics, and I don't think there's any end to those, and we can keep an engaged group of members on our NAC, then the future will unfold naturally, I think, and hopefully it will be good for everybody.
If there are listeners listening right now who say, I want to be part of that, I want to support the NAC or support the FLC and their missions, what opportunities do they have?
Well, I would just say for federal lab people, there are all kinds of volunteer opportunities in the FLC. By being the NAC chair, I'm an ad hoc member of the FLC board. So I go to the quarterly board meetings and I see firsthand what all the opportunities are. And there are many, many volunteer opportunities, particularly on the three pillar committees, the committees that work the missions of promote, educate, and facilitate. They're looking for members from the labs. They have regular meetings. They get engaged in the issues of interest to the labs. And so if you're a federal lab member out there and you would like to get involved, I would say go to the website, the FLC website, and it will tell you how you can contact someone at the FLC about getting engaged or volunteering, or how you can contact these committees. So be proactive on the lab side because the opportunities are there. And again, the labs are so big, 300 federal labs and all the lab members, it's difficult for FLC to know who to reach out to. But if you have interest, I guarantee FLC will find a way to plug you in.
Excellent. And that sort of brings us into our next question about how federal tech transfer has been called a contact sport because it so heavily relies on personal contacts and connections. But now in these last few years, as we've seen, that has shifted more and more to virtual and hybrid situations. So what have you seen as the impacts of that change?
As everyone knows, COVID has changed the landscape, I think, forever. So while most of the contact was perhaps physical pre-COVID, it became almost all virtual during COVID and even immediately after COVID. And it's now returning, I think, to a mix. But I don't think we'll ever return to the old days of all the physical contact at the expense of virtual. People have experienced virtual. They love it. They like working from home. It's efficient. They can reach out to so many more people. So to me, I think it's a matter of embracing this new model of virtual and hybrid, where we do things through a mix of virtual and a mix of physical contact. But I think what that means is rethinking how we do things, how we do our meetings, for example, whereas we had all in-person meetings and then during COVID, all virtual meetings. Now we have the opportunity for hybrid meetings. So there's some things that can only be done physically, in physical contact, or best be done. But there's a whole bunch of other things that we can do virtually. And so thinking about how we redesign what we do to leverage the strengths of both, I think is a key going forward. And it's a huge opportunity for FLC because it's an opportunity to reach virtually those federal lab people who could not afford to go to a federal meeting, a national meeting in person, or who couldn't get the financial support from their organization to do that. But reaching out virtually, there are no bounds on that. So it's trying to figure out how to take advantage of the best of both worlds and being very conscious in designing what we do to leverage the advantages of each one, I think.
Okay. Well, we are a community of very flexible and adaptable people, so I'm sure that there's a lot of potential there. And tech transfer professionals do have to be so many things. They have to be translators between tech and industry, mediators in among different stakeholders with different priorities. They build relationships. They have to have foresight into a technology's market potential. There's a lot on their plates. What advice do you have for those who would want to get involved in federal tech transfer or maybe are already in and want to continue to grow and improve?
I guess I would say, as in any profession, there is no limit to learning, that it's a matter of continuous education. And so for the professional tech transfer person, there's always new horizons, whether you've had 2 years experience or 10 years or 20 years experience, there's always new horizons. So stay hungry and keep educating yourself. And in that regard, FLC has a treasure trove of educational programs. One of the advantages of FLC is every lab doesn't have to have its own education and training program. That's something that FLC has centralized, and they continue to build their inventory of courses, whether it's web courses or online courses or in-person courses. There's always new ones being added at every level. And so, I always encourage all of us to continue to educate ourselves. I think maybe another way, this is probably not a mainstream idea, but I really like the idea of boards who would consider rotating scientists and engineers into the order shop for a tour and then back out again, rather than having 100% tech transfer professionals. To me, an ideal order is a cadre of full-time professionals, but then scientists and engineers from the bench rotating into the order, having a tour of a couple years, and then rotating back out, because they can bring that scientist and engineer perspective to the order, and then they can take the tech transfer message back out to their colleagues when they rotate back out. It's easier said than done to do that. And I think what it takes, in my mind, is very strong support from the lab senior leadership to do that. They have to assure these scientists and engineers that if you go to the order, you're not going to be stuck there forever. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but from a scientist and engineer's perspective, they may say, if I go there, I may never come back and limit my career opportunities. And so they have to have assurance that if they go, they're going to rotate back out again, and it won't damage their career. In fact, it will even enhance their career. And that's probably a little bit different career model for S&Es than is a standard at many federal labs.
If there's any ORDAs listening or lab leadership listening, take note of this idea. It might start catching on. And have you ever unexpectedly encountered a technology or product in your life outside of work that you realized you had a hand in commercializing?
Unfortunately, I have to say no. I can't say that I invented Tang in the lab and it's used out there by other people. That said, though, I'll tell you, I am continually conscious of everyday products that are based on technologies that came out of the federal labs. And we're all familiar with what many of those are. It's probably the smartphone is one that has such a combination of technologies, many of them that have their roots in the federal labs. Unfortunately, what happens is I think the audit trail for that technology coming from the lab gets lost. It's just the way things work because the labs do the early work on the technology. They discover a breakthrough, but then industry takes that and they add to it and they do their own research to commercialize it. And the origins of the technology coming from the lab just get lost in the process. And I'm not sure that will ever change. I think it's just endemic in the way our system works. But I think any of us who were in the federal labs can take great pride that many of our inventions or maybe the technologies we sponsored really are at the heart of so many of today's products that each of us uses every day. So I wish I could claim one. I can't, but I certainly am conscious of what the federal labs have contributed and continue to contribute to today's society, both economically and socially.
Dick Paul, thank you again so much for this conversation. It's really been a pleasure, and for all of your insight and your contributions to the federal tech transfer space over the years. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Again, it's my pleasure to participate, and I am so proud of being associated with the FLC through the National Advisory Council. And the importance of the federal labs and tech transfer can never be understated. So anything we can all do to promote it, I'm on board. So again, thank you for having me.
I have to give an extra thanks to Dick Paul because he was actually the first person to agree to be interviewed for this podcast before it had even launched. So he didn't know quite how it would come out or exactly what he was signing up for. And still, he was game to share his time and his remarkable experiences. Though I will say this is not his first rodeo. Each year at the FLC National Meeting, Dick hosts the Lab Directors Forum, where he leads a discussion with the newly awarded Laboratory Director of the Year. You can watch those conversations on the FLC's Learning Center, a constantly growing, totally free digital library of tech transfer resources and learning materials. To get there, go to federallabs.org, click the Educate tab at the top, and choose the FLC Education page. Then click the button that says Go to the FLC Learning Center. If it's your first time, you'll have to create a free account, and then there you go. You have access to webinars, courses, and other content designed for different career paths and experience levels. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back in 2 weeks on Transfer Files Tuesday. Thanks for tuning in to the Transfer Files, your insider's look at federal tech transfer. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay connected for more episodes exploring how hundreds of government laboratories and countless industry partners are driving innovations that shape our lives.